Welcome back to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. As you are aware, we are in a series of lectures collectively entitled Cultural Studies. These lectures are being brought to you by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. The lectures are for students in engineering colleges and in IITs, where humanities and social sciences are taught as both core and elective subjects. I am Lisa and I teach at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in IIT Guwahati. So, we have already been through the introductory lecture in the first lecture of this series. The lecture being given today is a continuation of the first lecture, in that we look at the scope of cultural studies in a bid to understand cultural studies as a discipline, as a domain. Some of the characteristics of cultural studies were already talked about in the first lecture. For instance, we saw that cultural studies was quite resolutely interdisciplinary in nature, and by the fact that it has no real referent and it is to do with ways of talking, we also found ways of talking about cultural forms, cultural practices. We saw that key terms and concepts are central to the discourse of cultural studies. Well, before we begin to talk about the topic in every lecture, we are going to do a brief recap. Okay, at the beginning of each lecture, we are going to talk about briefly about what we did in the last lecture, in a bid to retain a degree of continuity from the previous lectures. So, we move on now to the recap of lecture 1, and we saw that Chris Barker, in his Sage Dictionary of Cultural Studies, terms cultural studies, the domain of cultural studies, as an interdisciplinary or post-disciplinary field, and also he points to the fact that cultural studies really is a language game. It is constituted by the language game of talking in various ways, in redescribing redescribing cultural practices, forms, institutions, in a bid, as we will find later, in a bid to remove established ways and patterns of thinking that we may have collected over so many years, and that the theoretical terms developed and deployed by persons calling their work cultural studies, these themselves constitute what cultural studies is. Then we found that Raymond Williams, Richard Hoggart and E. P. Thompson are the three persons who were responsible for eventually leading to the discipline cultural studies, and we also saw that we could actually pinpoint a date, as far as the birth, so to speak, of cultural studies as a discipline, as an academic discipline is concerned, and for that we need to go back to the establishment of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies of Culture at the University of Birmingham, whose first director was Richard Hoggart. Then we saw that this break from established ways of thinking, which eventually led to the formation of cultural studies as a discipline, is characterized by what we call culturalism, materialism and Marxism. At least the early phase, it is not that cultural studies as a discipline has remained with these characteristics. As we shall see, there has been a cultural turn. In fact, we saw from Bennett and Frau that the cultural turn is about meanings, is about discourses, about meaning formation, signification, along with the fact that it does retain a certain culturalism and definitely a Marxist point of analysis. Then we define culture as something that is ordinary, and we distinguish it from commonsensical ways of looking at culture as to do with cultural practices, like for instance cultural forms like music, theatre, etc. And we said that no, culture is ordinary, and we saw through Raymond Williams that culture is a way of life, and cultural studies takes as its data the various everyday practices and cultural forms, right, that constitute our culture, right. So, in that I should add here that popular culture also therefore becomes a very important part of cultural studies, a very important part of the data of cultural studies, right. So, culture is then ordinary, culture is a way of life, culture is democratized, and culture is to do with the creation and generation of meaning, right. We also saw that we need to make a difference between cultural studies and the study of culture, in that the study of culture, we may say safely, is to do with the older ways of doing anthropology, okay, whereas cultural studies is to do with symbolic forms and their signifying practices. Therefore, a few of the ways in which culture is variously seen, with the points that we can glean from the last lecture, okay, are these: that culture is a tool, okay, culture is a tool through which we find our way in our social and cultural lives. Culture is a language, culture refers to artifacts, culture of course is a way of life, and culture is deeply imbued with power. So, these are the various ways in which we shall be looking at culture in our course cultural studies. So, the key source texts in this second lecture are Chris Barker's Cultural Studies, Theory and Practice, a book which I said in lecture 1, maybe if you are to choose a particular text as a textbook, this would be it. And the other books in this referred to in this course are again by Barker, the Sage Dictionary of Cultural Studies and Making Sense of Cultural Studies, Stuart Hall's edited volume Representations, Tony Bennett and John Frau's edited volume The Sage Handbook of Cultural Analysis, and Pramod Nair's An Introduction to Cultural Studies. Right. Well, so the lecture today is designed in such a way as to be able to unpack, okay, the scope of cultural studies. So, while we talk about the scope of cultural studies and all that is entailed, okay, in the study of cultural studies, of course, we can't talk about all that is entailed, at least within the limits of a single 1 hour lecture, but we shall be able to understand what cultural studies is as a domain as we look at the various the various things that fall into the scope of cultural studies. These would also all that I am going to say in this lecture on understanding cultural studies is most of it is going to be reflected in individual lectures devoted to individual topics. Okay. So, I hope by looking at some of the components of cultural studies, we will be able to understand in a better way, okay, what this domain is all about, what this discipline is all about, if at all we can call it a discipline. Fine. The first thing that we need to note here is many, or rather it is, it has been an accepted way of considering nature and nurture as separate. Okay. Nature is related to biology, nature is, people think nature is different from culture, but in our course we are going to have we are going to look at ourselves, okay, and ourselves as cultural beings, right, from a biocultural perspective. So, we bring in nature and nurture together. We do not really separate these as binary oppositions and say that nature is different and nurture is different. In at least the cluster of lectures in module 1 devoted to what science has to tell us about ourselves as cultural beings. Therein we shall be able to see that nature and nurture cannot, or nature and culture are not to be separated when we try and build a discourse on understanding ourselves as cultural beings. Second, cultural studies also looks at the body, right. Now, this follows from the slide before this. The individual body is not again a individual, not isolated, okay, and it is not it is not an individual body in the sense that the body becomes a social instrument. Okay. We are cultural beings, we are in a body. So, the body too is understood. The scope of cultural studies includes looking at the body as a social or a cultural instrument and a docile, as one of the philosophers Michel Foucault has said, as a docile tool of productivity, a malleable or manipulable tool of productivity. So, beginning with biology, beginning with the body, we find that cultural studies also encompasses looking at the body as a cultural form, okay, not simply as a biological form. Next, as I mentioned in the first lecture, subjectivity is an immensely important term. It is a key term with identity, really perhaps among the most important terms in cultural studies, and much of what we are going to talk about hinges around subjectivity, and via Chris Barker we may define subjectivity on 3 levels. A, that subjectivity may be defined as a condition of being a person, and subjectivity also refers to the processes that go into the construction of a person, and it is the experience of being a person. Recall also from the last lecture that objectivity is highly suspect in cultural studies. Okay. We understand everything to do with culture, including science, as emanating from human beings, from knowledge produced by human beings, okay, and much of it is understood as being subjective, whether at the individual level or whether at the collective level. Okay. Knowledge, therefore, cultural forms are seen as subjective forms, and subjectivity is an important part, important component of cultural studies, right. The next term that we have to look at is identity, and like subjectivity, it is a cornerstone really of cultural studies, and identity is also a key term that contributes to the discourse of cultural studies, and these other terms also come in as far as the cultural studies domain is concerned, and these terms are terms like class, ethnicity, gender, race and sexuality. Okay. These are also part and parcel of ourselves as cultural beings, in that we belong to a certain class or an ethnic group, or at least a community or a race. We have certain sexual orientations, and also we are our behavior is largely constructed by the expectations of gender roles and gender models. Okay. So, remember what was our mega question: why do we live the kind of lives that we live? So, why do we live the kind of lives that we live is informed, okay, by these categories, right. These categories are categories of identity: class, ethnicity, gender, race and sexuality, right. So, are we as cultural beings also live out our lives according to where we find ourselves in these categories. What cultural studies does again is question quite radically what is meant by common sense. Okay. Common sense, cultural studies holds may be spontaneous, it may be unconscious, but common sense is nothing but the habits of thinking, the patterns of thinking that we have collected and which need to be queried. Okay, we need to scrutinize common sense, and in a bit, and our goal in cultural studies is to show that whatever is common need not be full of sense. Okay, so our cultural practices are informed by these many forms of common sense, which may behind their so-called innocent veneer, or behind their so-called naturalized naturalized hues, may actually contribute to certain social inequalities, and may also help in power to instantiate itself in many ways. Okay. So, common sense is again an area that is looked at. It is within the scope of cultural studies to unravel what is not sort of sensible in common sense. Then the scope of cultural studies includes, very importantly, the study of ideology. Okay, ideology is understood as ideas, or it's understood as consciousness, a certain worldview, the way we look and understand and perceive the world and our place in it. Okay, it can also become a doctrine if you follow a particular ideology, or you are caught in a certain ideology, and these ideology also forms the maps of meaning. Okay. So, ideology therefore is an important part of cultural studies, because it tells us that as cultural beings, right, we are to a large extent under the sway of certain ideologies or ways of thinking. And in some of our lectures, for instance, in our lecture on Marxism, we shall find that ideology is part and parcel of the power of the ruling class, right. So, we are constituted by ideology, and our actions are are propelled, so to speak, by the ideologies or the worldviews that we hold in our minds. Okay. So, if culture is ordinary, culture is to do with ways of life. These ways of life are, as cultural studies will show us, are deeply imbued by certain ways of thinking, right. In fact, Chris Barker in the Sage Dictionary of Cultural Studies has this to say about the importance of ideology in cultural studies. Now, he says this: so influential has the concept of ideology been within cultural studies that the whole field was once dubbed ideological studies. Okay, so, this is just to show you how important the study of ideology is in cultural studies. Then the scope of cultural studies, within which we understand the domain of cultural studies, has representation as a very important term in it. Okay, representation, or to represent things, right. We understand everything as a representation, or everything is mediated, right. Any representation is mediated by a certain ideology or a certain way of thinking. Okay. So, representation therefore, if you look at this slide, is both inclusive and exclusive, right. It includes some people and it excludes others. It includes certain ways of thinking and it excludes other ways of thinking. So, representation we understand as in cultural studies, we understand as being always impartial, always provisional, and always whether overtly or covertly, okay, always backed by power. So, the scope of cultural studies also entails an understanding of terms like representation, and how representations are often, as mentioned by one of the critics, Danny Cavalier, are often also misrepresentations of things. Then let me bring your attention to an important phrase called the circuit of culture, and this is by Stuart Hall, and we came across Stuart Hall in our first lecture. And Stuart Hall gives us this diagram, this circuit of culture. Okay. So, culture may be understood as a circuit having certain components. Okay. These components are in turn in turn the key concepts or terms that build the discourse of cultural studies. Okay. And these are A, representation, regulation, identity, consumption and production. So, the circuit of culture is again one of the fundamental fundamental formulations that any scholar in cultural study needs to look at. Okay. Representation, regulation, consumption, identity and production are its key components, are the key components in this circuit as given to us by Stuart Hall. Then also we understanding cultural studies entails recognizing the fact that language, language really is what Chris Barker calls a central concern in cultural studies. So, according to Chris Barker, language is a central concern of cultural studies. It is the means and medium for the generation of significance or meaning. We saw in the last lecture that meaning creation or the generation of meaning is one of the ways in which culture is understood. Culture is a site, culture is an agent for the generation of meaning in our socio-cultural practices, right. So, Chris Barker says that how do we talk about meaning? How is meaning generated? And he says that language is the chief concern in cultural studies, in that it is both the means by which meaning is generated, significance is generated, and it is also the medium for the generation of meaning. So, let us read on from Chris Barker. The concept of meaning is core to the explication of culture. To investigate culture is to explore, look at this, to investigate culture, this is how we understand both the methodology and the domain of cultural studies, right. To investigate culture is to explore how meaning is produced symbolically in language as a signifying system. It is only through language that you can have meaning. You can have the generation, the encoding and the decoding of meaning. So, to investigate culture, what is culture again? The practices of our our ordinary practices, our everyday day-to-day practices, right. So, to investigate culture from a cultural studies methodology, using a cultural studies methodology entails this, is to explore how meaning is produced symbolically in language as a signifying system. Here meaning is generated through difference, the relation of one signifier to another, rather than by reference to fixed entities in an independent object world. Now, at this juncture we will not unpack this, because I will be devoting this a lecture solely to understanding this, which is the lecture on structuralism, how culture is full of signifying practices and how there is no really following a linguistic model, there is no direct reference to things both in language and in culture obtain their meaning by a system of difference and a system of relation to other units in that. So, culture in that sense works like a language. At this juncture, suffice it for us to simply understand that culture is explored by looking at our symbolic practices, right, by looking at the way in which meaning is created. And how is meaning created? Meaning is created because of this phenomenon called language. Language is both the, as he says, Barker says here, both the means and the medium for the generation of meaning, right. Indeed, in another book, Making Sense of Cultural Studies, Barker says, the machinery and operations of language are central concerns and problems for cultural studies. Indeed, the investigation of culture has often been regarded as virtually interchangeable with the exploration of meaning produced symbolically through signifying systems that work like a language. So, important. So, central is language in cultural studies, that we look at our cultural practices in terms also of language, in terms of signifying practices, practices that generate meaning. Therefore, from this we may argue, again arguing for a subjective, for the importance of subjectivity and the relative the fact that objectivity is highly suspect in cultural studies, we therefore go on to say that there are no objective truths, right. That there can only be justifications. Knowledge is a matter of being able to justify. Remember, we had used the term epistemology in the last lecture, and how did we define epistemology? We defined epistemology as the theory of knowledge. We define epistemology as a branch in philosophy, okay, that looks at the scope, the origins and the limits of knowledge, limits in the sense of the conditions under which knowledge is possible. There may be different ways in which we can get knowledge. For instance, empiricism is one way in which knowledge may be constructed, rationalism is another way. Okay. Now, as far as knowledge production, as far as meaning production is concerned in cultural studies, Barker and other scholars say that, well, it all depends on how you justify, right, how you justify a belief. For instance, we make this difference, at least for elementary purposes, we make this difference or distinction between belief and knowledge, right. We say that we may hold a belief that need not be knowledge, right. So, knowledge is defined as justified belief, a belief that has been justified. Now, cultural studies holds that in a scenario where we can never have objective truths, because everything is a representation, right, and representations are made by human beings in a certain condition of knowledge, okay, in a certain knowledge situation, which has been given rise to by contingent events, by being in a particular situation in space and time. Okay. So, cultural studies therefore holds that all you can do is only put forward justifications, and justifications are represented through one medium, which is language. Okay. So, therefore, knowledge becomes more a subjective matter, and subjectivity is therefore one of, again like language, a central concern in cultural studies, right. So, what have we understood till now? I would say that culture is understood, okay, if you have to understand culture and cultural studies, culture is understood as not high forms and practices. Culture is ordinary, culture is part and parcel of our way of life, the cultural practices, the forms, the institutions. Education, for instance, is an institution, okay, and is part of culture, right. Culture is democratized, and culture is to do with the production of meaning. As far as this last point is concerned, we found that the production of meaning, behind the production of meaning, the means and medium for significance and meaning creation is none but language, okay. And we found that there are other important things like representation, which is always partial, like epistemology, like subjectivity, where knowledge is ultimately a matter of not knowing an objective truth, but about justifications. Now, the more you can justify, the more whatever you put forward is understood as knowledge. Now, behind these justifications are also issues of power in politics. Okay, whose definition should we take? Whose description should we take? Right? And we also found that one of the concerns of cultural studies is to re-describe, to signify things, okay, to talk about things in newer ways. Cultural studies is all about talking about things in newer ways, building different discourses, so that habitual patterns of thinking, habitual ways of thinking are sort of dismantled, and we begin to see things anew. Okay. So, so far this is what is meant by cultural studies, which is what is meant by studying cultural studies, studying our culture from a cultural studies methodology. This is what is meant by studying culture using a cultural studies methodology. Okay. Then the scope of cultural studies also includes studying other issues in terms of cultural formations. Okay. For instance, the nation is seen as a cultural construct. Now, many of us have are used to thinking of nations as a given. For instance, I am an Indian, my nationality is Indian, I belong to a place which has certain boundaries, okay? And there is geographically we are all bound together in in a country known as India. In cultural studies, we re-describe this, okay, by talking about nation in a different way. This is one example in how by which you can understand what we do in cultural studies. Okay, what we do is we re-describe things. We sort of try we sort of try and cancel out, okay, established ways of thinking. Now, the example I am giving you is that of nation, and what would cultural studies say? Cultural studies would say that nation is not simply a political organization. Okay? Nation is also a matter of discourse. Now, you may think, how is nation, the nation is a political and administrative unit, it has definite geographical boundaries. How is nation a matter of language? How is nation a matter of discourse? Okay? The answer is nation is a cultural construct, okay, and we represent nation. We represent nation in language, and nation is a discourse, right? Nation is symbolic. For example, how is nation symbolic? The nation is symbolic in the sense that our perception of a unitary nation is held together in the common imagination of the people, okay, by certain symbols, certain images. For instance, the national flag, the national flag, the national anthem, and various things that signify our nation. So, the nation is to be understood as discursive, the nation is to be understood as symbolic, because even if we do not, it is impossible for us to know each and every member of our nation, we nonetheless are bound together by a commonality, okay, or common pool of, so to speak, imaginative or resources in the imagination, and these are, as we said, our national anthem, our national flag, and we also have so many sort of national things like our national flower, or our national dance form, etc. Okay, so this is one way in which we understand what we do in cultural studies. Okay, we see almost everything as a discursive creation, or as a creation of language, as a creation of representation, as a creation of subjectivity, right. So, this this whole understanding of all cultural forms, right, all cultural practices and institutions as first and foremost a matter of language, a matter of signifying practices, a matter of symbolic practices. This, I would say, is how cultural studies is different from other domains, different also from its kindred related domains like anthropology, like sociology, literature and language. Further, I had alluded to science in the last lecture, and I said that even science is seen as a discourse, okay, and the understanding of ourselves, as beings, right, is, when we look at science as a discourse, you find, for instance, that science mediate culture. If you look at this slide here, as I said, it's all about description, right. So, if you have a question like, if you pose a question like, what is it to be a human being, right, then you are increasingly drawing from the domains or discourses, so to speak, of genetics, of science and technology, and of the medical sciences. Okay. So, when you describe yourself as a human being from, from within biology, for instance, then you would say that it is science that is that is enabling you. It is a discourse of science that is enabling you. It is science that is mediating force in your understanding or description of yourself as a human being. Do you follow? So, understanding culture, understanding what cultural studies does is also entails looking at areas like science which are not considered part of culture, okay, which is things like domains like science, which are considered by, for instance, the positivists as being isolated from all other different cultural activities. But we would say in cultural studies, like science too is a cultural activity. Science too is a description in language. Science too uses a common pool of symbols, okay, and science too needs to be self-reflexive in its understanding of how it is a cultural practice. More about this when we talk about science, technology and cultural studies in a lecture in module 4, right. So, therefore, this is related to the beginning of cultural studies really. Cultural studies began also, okay, as what many would call an insurgent sociology, right. It was part of sociology in the fact that it did not agree with some of the impulses in theoretical impulses in sociology, particularly positivism, right. So, it was an insurgent sociology that was against a purely functionalist view of culture, okay. It tried to say that, well, there are huge issues to do with power and politics behind the so-called working of society, behind the so-called functions of the different units of society. Do you understand? For instance, let us take an example, the family. For instance, the family is a core unit in sociology, it is a core unit of society, right. And if you study family simply from the point of view of how family as a functional part of society, and you do not talk about the politics of the family, you do not talk about unequal power relations, okay, within a family, then you are doing simply a functionalist analysis of family as a unit. And not only that, you are dangerously playing into the hands of very powerful discourses, right, and very powerful ideologies that hold the family to be simply a well functioning unit of society, hiding issues of inequality and hiding issues of power and politics within the family, okay. So, therefore, cultural studies is to be understood as almost as a domain that resists, okay, certain established ways of thinking, particularly the functionalist and positivist ways of looking at our cultural forms and institutions. Secondly, cultural studies also came about as a critique, okay, as a radical critique of instrumental rationality. Now, by instrumental rationality, we mean that reason rationality that is used, okay, that is used to maintain the status quo, right. That is, it comes from an unwavering faith in science and technology. It comes from looking at science and technological rationality, okay, as an imperative, which has around which we are not to look at issues of power and politics, for instance. It came about, cultural studies therefore came about as a staunch and radical critique, okay, of such kind of rationality, okay. Such kind of rationality gave us a sense of an objectivity, okay, that was that could talk about that everything from talk about everything in the sense that it would give us the truth with a capital T, so to speak, okay. So, there was, therefore, cultural studies is again a domain that looks very is very suspicious about a functionalist way of looking at culture and positivist way of looking at knowledge, and it is also deeply critical of instrumental rationality. It would rather devise a critical rationality, putting rationality to the test, critiquing rationality and accepting the best that is there from rationality or reason based thinking, okay. So, again, therefore, Barker says that we have to understand that power, let us look at this slide, power, okay, which gives a domain the right to name, okay, which creates official versions, right, and which creates common sense, which legitimizes knowledge, right. Power is therefore, like subjectivity, like identity, like representation, a key concept and a key term in cultural studies. And in fact, cultural studies goes on to say that everything is infused with power, right, everything is imbued with power. There is nothing that is natural, okay. All systems are imbued with power, okay, and that is the reason why cultural studies has as its methodology, okay, the need to redescribe things, okay. If power can name something, then we need to, in a bid to counter power, we will have to redescribe and rename things, okay. We have to remove the labels that power has given, okay, and we have to redescribe these things, right. For instance, again, as we saw the the understanding of family as a perfectly working unit, functional unit contributing to society, is a description that has been given by by the dominant culture, by dominant ideologies, okay, as we said, hiding the practices of power that are there, right. So, moment we redescribe family as not simply a functional unit, but as an arena or a site of power and subjectivity and of identity, then what we are doing is we are challenging the dominant ways of looking at the family by redescribing. Okay. So, you understand that is how language is used in cultural studies. Okay. Language is the tool, the means and medium of cultural studies. It is the tool, it is really a technology of kind of resisting power, right. Moment you can re-signify and re-describe, half the battle is already won, because we begin to, as we say, cancel out habitual ways of thinking. So, therefore, as Barker says, power needs to be investigated, okay, because power legitimizes the dominant ways of thinking. Then cultural studies is also, as we say, not only about discourses, it is not only about abstractions and key concepts. Cultural studies has as part of its scope, okay, a certain pragmatic way of thinking. Yes, we do redescribe things, we do look at the workings of power, of the politics of representation, of everything as cultural forms, as subjective forms, but we also have a pragmatic attitude, in the sense that we understand everything in culture to be not at all representative of things in its totality. Pragmatism sees cultural forms, institutions and practices as anti-representational, as having no foundations, as being provisional and being anti-realist, in the sense that we cannot ever have a complete understanding of reality. All we can have really are representations. So, all this is towards social policy, okay, towards making cultural, social policies and social reform. So, cultural studies definitely has as part of its methodology and scope a deeply political commitment, and the commitment is that we redescribe things. Okay, we talk about power, representation and identity, etc., in not simply as a linguistic exercise. This is what many people, many critics of cultural studies, perhaps they make this mistake of understanding cultural studies only talking about, only about rarefied discourses, where you keep on redescribing things and talk about everything as having no foundations. That is not at all the point. Cultural studies has as part of its scope a very powerful aspect, and that is showing, unraveling the politics, the workings of politics, okay, in culture, of power in culture, and to help devise policies that would contribute to cultural and social reform. So, I would end with finally with one of the very important words in cultural studies, and that is discourse. Okay, we found that cultural studies, we found through Barker that cultural studies may also be called the discursive formation, okay, ways of speaking. So, discourses therefore, in cultural studies are objects, they are structured systems and structuring systems. Discourses are ideological systems, and discourses of course are texts that can be decoded by us. Okay. So, if everything is a way of speaking, right, then obviously these are very powerful objects, right, they are highly structured objects. They are also objects that structure us as cultural beings. They are filled with ideology or ways of thinking, and that is why the understanding of discourse, and we have in fact a whole lecture devoted to discourse, where we shall be looking at discourse in detail. But at this level it is important for us to understand that discourse is important because discourse enables power. Okay, let us look at the slide please. Discourse enables power, discourse creates power. Okay. And with power we find that power can give us justifications. Okay, power can give us justifications that finally go on to become truths. Power through discourse can give us meaning, power gives us morality, and power describes and power determines our practices. Okay. So, what are the therefore, what are the terms that make up the scope of cultural studies? Okay. First, we found that we cannot make a clear distinction, we ought not to make a clear distinction between what is natural and what is cultural. We are biological beings and we are cultural beings, and the best way to understand ourselves as part and parcel of being part and parcel of culture is from a biocultural perspective. Then we also saw that cultural studies is essentially formations of discourse, and there we found that we cannot ever claim a truly or purely objectivist or a purely objective understanding of reality. Okay. Cultural forms, in that they are constructed by human beings who are themselves part of cultural practices and ways of life. Cultural forms are therefore subjective forms, right. Culture is to do with representations, with the effects of representation. It is mediated through language. Okay, it is mediated through discourse, and behind dominant cultural practices are issues of power and politics. Okay. And finally, we saw that cultural studies is not simply talking about things in different ways and redescribing things. Okay. Cultural studies has as its goal or its goal is a political one, in the sense that it seeks to finally contribute, okay, to social reform and to better cultural policies, simply by using their findings as they make is to find out how meaning is constructed, how discourses are formed, how discourses and representations have power, okay, to make this world a better place by showing how inequality operates because of misrepresentation, for instance. Okay. How media forms, again for instance, instantiate certain ways, certain definitions, for instance of being a woman in society, or being a good mother, for instance. All these are matters of power and representation, and this essentially is brought about by certain practices of meaning formation. So, how meaning is constructed, how meaning operates in culture, in our ways of life, how significance, okay, comes in. In fact, Clifford Geertz defines culture as the webs of significance that have been spun by us, that have been spun by man, in which we are all suspended. Okay. So, it is important for us therefore, as being as cultural beings, to see how we are constituted, what are the descriptions that we go by, what are the descriptions that we abide by, okay, and in doing so we help help the process of help processes in cultural policy, in trying to devise better ways of living, better descriptions, more fair descriptions, okay, and also lead to better ways of really living, more encompassing ways of living. So, what we have done in this lecture is we have tried to understand cultural studies by pointing at some of its constituent terms and some of its articulations, and all this would be unpacked in the lectures to come. So, we end with a quotation again from Chris Barker, and you know Chris Barker's text Cultural Studies Theory and Practice is a text that you could take up as a textbook really for this course. And Barker says here, the forms of power that cultural studies explores are diverse. Remember, cultural studies targets power, right? The forms of power that cultural studies explores are diverse and include gender, race, class, colonialism, etc. Cultural studies seeks to explore the connection between these forms of power and develop ways of thinking about culture and power that can be utilized by agent in the pursuit of change. Okay? So, if anyone says that cultural studies is really a rarefied, only a discursive, a linguistic exercise, and they are utterly wrong, okay? Because all these investigations are really, as Barker says here, to be used by us in the pursuit of social change and of cultural and political change. Okay. So, we move on then to the discussion, and for our first question here is, why are subjectivity and identity central concerns in cultural studies? Subjectivity is a central concern in cultural studies, because every cultural form is seen really as a subjective form in an individual or collective sense, and the study of subjectivity is important because subjectivity is what is a condition, okay? It forms a condition by which we are formed as persons, right, by which we understand ourselves as human beings. Okay? Then subjectivity also is important as a key term in cultural studies, because subjectivity really are the processes, or rather subjectivity comprises the processes that go into the construction of ourselves as human beings, as cultural beings, as knowing beings. Okay? And finally, subjectivity is about the experience of being a person. Okay? All these are cultural constructions, right, and how we are made subjects. Remember, in the first lecture I had said that if you have a question like why do we live the kind of lives that we live, in cultural studies we need to reformulate this as how are we constructed as subjects. Okay? So, we are essentially then in cultural studies subjects, we are agents, and how our subjectivity has been formed. This should be one of the first questions we ask in cultural studies. Then identity is again important, identity vis-a-vis subjectivity. If subjectivity is our inner life, our experiences and the processes that go into it, identity is seen by many, at least in distinction to subjectivity, as the social label that is given to us. Okay? So, identity, the study of identity is immensely important as a scope, as part of the scope in cultural studies, because identity is tied to issues of class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, race. In that we use phrases like our racial identity, our ethnic identity, our class identity, our sexual identity and our gender identity. Okay? These also are part and parcel of the labels that are given to us in our cultural practices. Okay? So, how we are formed as beings in culture. Okay? Subjectivity and identity, right, are the key areas that we need to explore if we have to understand ourselves as cultural beings. Next question, how does cultural studies problematize common sense? Okay, and we saw that common sense is not exactly to be considered sensible, okay, in cultural studies, and common sense we found is spontaneous, too spontaneous we would say, and unconscious. When things are spontaneous and unconscious, then we consider these to be not well thought out, and we consider these to be part and parcel or the tools of ideology or the tools of the workings of power. Okay? So, cultural studies also looks at common sense, the whole idea of common sense, and tries to in fact Stuart Hall in one of his essays says that we have to look at the so called commonsensical practices and to see what goes behind making something a matter of common sense, and we will see that there are issues of power and politics and ideology behind things that are considered commonsensical. Okay. Therefore, common sense is tied to ideology, basically to dominant forms of ideology, right, and we described ideology as ideas, doctrines, consciousness, worldview and maps of meaning. Now, these again we may unpack this further, and we can say that power has power is about naming things, okay, and making those names stick, those descriptions stick. Power is what gives rise to common sense and official versions, and power is what legitimize all these things. The descriptions that you give, the common sense knowledge and official versions are all workings of power, and these need to be scrutinized if these have to be dismantled. Then finally, why is it important to study discourse in cultural studies? Remember, cultural studies itself is defined by Chris Barker as discursive formations or ways of speaking. This is important. We need to look at discourse, and discourse forms an important part of the scope of cultural studies, in that discourse creates power. Okay. Discourse creates power, and discourse and power give us what we understand and accept as truth, whereas we say in cultural studies that there is no objective truth, all forms of knowledge are subjective. Okay. Then power gives us meaning, gives us descriptions, power gives us our practices, and power finally gives us our morality. Okay. So, remember, cultural studies sees everything as representation, effects. Cultural studies sees everything as provisional, right, and it is this very flexibility of knowledge in cultural studies that ultimately opens doors to social and cultural change. Remember, habits of thinking, okay, this is what is sought to be dismantled by cultural studies in a bid for social and cultural change. So, we come to the end of the second lecture, and I hope you have been able to at least have a grasp, okay, to begin with, of some of the terms like discourse, power, for instance, okay, representation, ideology, subjectivity, identity, okay, and the fact that cultural studies is a domain that is that has as one of its goals political change in society, okay, towards leading to a better way of living, and also as individuals we understand how we are constructed. Okay. Remember, again I leave you with our mega question, why do we live the kind of lives that we live? You have already by now, I hope, had some idea in the sense that why we live the kind of lives we live are really matters to do with subjectivity, to do with identity, to do with power, representation and discourse, among other key terms. Okay. So, we shall meet in the next lecture, and as I said, the next cluster of lectures in this module would be devoted to an understanding of ourselves as cultural beings from the point of view of what science has to tell us. Remember, we are not going to make a distinction between nature and culture here. Okay. We are also beings of nature, and the way we are described as natural beings, okay, is also a matter of language. At the same time, we share and as cultural beings, all of us share an evolutionary lineage, which has given rise to a certain mind. Okay, and culture has been there, created by the mind, which itself has changed with the changes in brain. So, we need to look at evolution, we need to look at evolutionary psychology, we need to look at how the brain has changed, for instance. Okay. So, I shall see you in the next class when we begin to talk about Darwinian evolution. Thank you.